BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. This is going to be an episode that is going to cover a lot of different subjects because I'm really trying to get to more of your requested topics and try to respond to some of the material that the listeners want to hear about. So if you have anything that you would like to ask about the Zodiac Killer, you can put your questions or ideas in the comments section down below, and maybe they will be worked into a future episode. And I do the Anything Goes Friday segment where any subject is fair game, and I did one bonus episode last week. It was only about 6 minutes long, but someone had requested a response to the story of Jared Atadero, a very tragic story from Colorado, and I did just that. It's called Who Killed Jared Atadero. The full title is Eviler Nature, Who Killed Jared Atadero. Always inviting you guys to visit some other content here on Black Box Online Radio, and you can hit the like button, subscribe, and those are just some great free ways that really help out the channel. If you like listening to the Zodiac Monday episodes and you are not subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so, as well as, of course, giving your feedback in the comments section down below. And a great way to help out all of these efforts is to go over to BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. Now, there was a comment that came in last week about request from Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCyphers.com, who was asking the question, why don't I do more Zodiac Killer interviews here on this channel for the Zodiac Monday segment? Then I could be talking to different guests, different published authors, as well as just people in the comments section, regular contributors on forums, and I think that that is an excellent idea, and I also talked about some other things, such as getting a co-host or doing the call-in show, or perhaps just doing things like panel discussions. But as far as the interview series goes, my honest answer is I don't believe that the Zodiac Killer channel's Interview with the Expert series has been completed. We did several of those interviews back in 2021. Richard Grinnell was one of the guests on that program. And we had talked about doing some other interviews, as well as doing like a panel discussion that would have a group of zodiologists, or zodiac experts, if you will. And part of me wants to complete that series. It's just the guys at the Zodiac Killer channel wanted to focus more on the podcast Serial Killer Z to A, and, that's their choice and their right to do so. But part of me really feels that that series was incomplete, and there's a lot more that we could do in that zone before I would start my own interview series here on Black Box Online Radio. But on that note, we might as well get to one of the biggest news stories related to the Zodiac Killer mystery, and Richard Grinnell, whom I just mentioned, as well as Ross Gerasi of Planet X Filmworks, appeared on the Vanished podcast. There's a new episode of the Vanished podcast talking about the Zodiac Killer, and, very, very good discussions, very insightful statements, and I really appreciate both Richard's perspective and Ross's perspective. Maybe it's fair to say that Richard Grinnell believes that the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69, and the focus of Richard's more or less theory is that The Zodiac committed the 5 canonical murders, the murders of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein from 1968 to 69, but what sets Richard Rennell apart from a lot of the other Zodiac theorists is he believes that a lot of the letters and ciphers that are unconfirmed were actually written by the killer, and Ross from Planet X Filmworks goes in somewhat of a different direction. He highly suspects that a lot of the pre-Zodiac crimes from the early 1960s were committed by the same Zodiac who did the Bay Area murders in the later part of the decade. And Ross has talked a lot about the murder of Ray Davis, the Swindle murders, the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, and of course the Domingos Edwards murders. And when Ross appeared on the Vanished podcast, he asked a particular challenge question. What would someone who doesn't think the Domingos Edwards murders were genuine Zodiac activity need to be persuaded to think that they were? And my honest answer is, while listening to Ross on the Vanished podcast, he made some very convincing claims. Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were murdered on June 4th of 1963 at a beach in Southern California. It's often referred to as the Gaviota shooting, even though it wasn't exactly in Gaviota State Park. They were off of Highway 101 in California, and they were attacked by somebody with a .22 caliber firearm. Now, it is a very similar crime to the Zodiac killer's Lake Berryessa stabbing, which took place on September 27th of 1969. Both killers brought a gun, a knife, pre-cut lengths of rope, and out of all of the pre-Zodiac crimes, I do believe that this is the highest and most likely chance of being a genuine Zodiac activity. Someone who was a growing and budding serial killer who went on to commit the Zodiac murders in a more calculated way. And there's also a theory that was put forward by one of you guys in the comments section years ago that the reason why there are so many differences between the Gaviota shooting in 1963 and the Zodiac killer's activities in 1968 and 69 is because the Gaviota shooting was a disaster. For example, Robert Domingos was able to break free from the restraints made with the pre-cut lengths of rope. He got into a fist fight with the killer. To the best of our knowledge, I mean, some of this is theoretical. It's not like anyone was videotaping it. And then he and Linda Edwards ran away. They were shot multiple times. The killer then dragged their bodies to a small seaside shack and tried to set the shack on fire. And I pointed out all of these differences in one episode, saying the Zodiac didn't move the bodies of the victim. The Zodiac didn't try to set anything on fire. Linda Edwards' swimsuit was cut open with a knife. The Zodiac certainly didn't do anything like that to the female victims. And one of you guys in the comments section just simply said that it's not that he was trying to do any of that in a sexual way. He was trying to cover up his failure. It's not a rage killing trying to set the seaside shack on fire. It's just he failed to commit the crimes in his calculated way. And Michael Cole talks about this a lot in the Zodiac Revisited trilogy when he says that this person probably thought about committing this crime over and over again, doing an enormous amount of mental planning, and then it all went haywire and it just turned into a giant disaster, and the killer just got lucky that he was able to gun down Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards. So that is entirely possible. I'm not 100% convinced that the Gaviota shooting was indeed the Zodiac killer, but I do think it's the highest and most likely scenario that there was a pre-Zodiac murder. For example, I think that one piece of evidence that we just simply do not know is, was the killer at the Gaviota Beach shooting wearing a hooded costume or not? Because, as I said, it's very similar to the Zodiac killer's 1969 Lake Berryessa stabbing, where the killer was wearing a hood, and but it's not just a typical bandana over his face or a ski mask. It is a very well-designed hood, and even if the guy's wearing like a pillowcase or a sack mask costume or something in 1963, somebody wanted a do-over. They wanted to recreate the crime and do it successfully. That's why the Zodiac killer only stabbed 2 victims, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, and the Zodiac killer only committed 1 murder by knife, to the best of our knowledge. Other things could have happened. There are also lots of possible Zodiac crimes. But if we knew whether or not that killer was wearing some type of mask, I think that would also raise the likelihood that the Gaviota Beach shooting, the murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, on the Zodiac killer's like attaching them to the Zodiac Killer in somewhat of a more convincing way. But I would also like to share something with you guys about the Zodiac Killer and the hooded costume. Last week on the channel, I posted some photos that were shared by an Instagram account called El Faro, because it is Holy Week in Spain. El Faro is a Spanish newspaper. And they were of somewhat of a similar costume. However, the costume was purple, and it was a guy in a leather jacket, and he had the purple mask hanging over him. And I thought that it was just a little bit similar, and I didn't really think too much of it. I was just sharing it, why not, and explore every single possibility. Well, that same publication, El Faro, shared some additional masks that are worn in Spain for Holy Week. These ones were black, and I have to tell you, these are some of the most convincingly similar masks compared to the Zodiac Killer's Lake Berryessa hood, and it's an extreme long shot that there's any type of connection between a Spanish religious mask and the Zodiac Killer. However, I did find that one of the articles that was talking about the different colors of the masks that are worn in Holy Week in Spain is from the city of Cadiz. The article was written by El País, and they shared some photos of the city of Cadiz, Cadiz. And it turns out, though, that Cadiz, Spain, is home to the largest American military base in Spain. And, I mean, just from a little bit of Googling, it says there are really only 2 military bases in Spain that are frequently, populated by Americans, 2 American military bases. The base in Cadiz, Spain, is actually a joint Spanish and American military base. It was opened in 1953, and there was an influx of Americans there in 1964, prior to the Zodiac Killer's crime spree. And I know that this is just a shot in the dark, excuse me for using that terrible expression, but part of me just thought for a very brief second, what if somebody obtained one of those masks while they were staying at the military base, and that mask could have been so easily modified into the Lake Berryessa costume. And in some of the religious attire that is worn for Holy Week in Spain, you'll see that there is a logo in the center of the costume, and others they have it on the side, but the Zodiac Killer wore his own logo in the exact center of the dicky flap that comes down, and so many people are trying to just figure out why on earth did he wear this intricate hooded costume? Well, if there already was a logo there, and the person knew how to sew, which I believe the Zodiac Killer did, he could have just sewn on his own logo right on top of that, as well as adding clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes. But one thing that Brian Hartnell, the surviving victim from Lake Berryessa, wanted to be very clear about was that the logo was sewn on with care and precision. It seemed like something that was done in a very precise way. And, my overall theory, no matter what you think about this thing's Spanish religious mask, yes, it looks very similar, but I believe that the mask already existed. Other people have pointed out some good examples: the welder's mask, the firefighter's hood, and now, even the Spanish religious mask, although that's somewhat of a long shot. I think that the mask already existed, and it was just easily modified by the Zodiac Killer prior to the Lake Berryessa stabbing. And somebody even brought that up when they were responding to Drew Beeson on his show, The Zodcast. He's put out some recent episodes, and Drew Beeson has also shared some additional information. He found out that there's a photo online of the park ranger at Lake Berryessa and Zodiac Killer suspect Dennis Land that has been mislabeled, and this guy's name is actually Bucky, and Drew posted the real photo of Dennis Land, saying that he obtained it from somebody, and these guys look absolutely different. And there are several photos out there that have been mislabeled and shared incorrectly, and it appears that even me on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, very frequently I have used that photo. It said that it was Dennis Land online, but it turns out that is not the park ranger, and you'll Dennis Land, who was the first person on site at Lake Berryessa to rescue Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. Dennis Land is mostly the Zodiac suspect in the hoax theory of Thomas Henry Horrid, who's the author of The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. But as far as I know, Thomas Horrid has stepped away from Dennis Land as being his suspect for the Lake Berryessa stabbing for a while. He was talking about Leonard Lake, actually, one of the Boneyard killers, the serial killer Leonard Lake. He adopted a new suspect suspect, but I don't really have too much recent information on that, but I do think it's important to share this more updated and correct photo of Dennis Land. Speaking of Drew Beeson, I have another requested topic that came in from someone. This was from Stefano, who sent this into the Facebook page. My personal Facebook is in the description box. There's also a page for Black Box Online Radio, and you can also write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And Stefano wanted a direct response to this, talking about Drew Beeson's theory, and it's actually a conversation that Stefano had with Drew Beeson about some of his observations, because Drew Beeson is also the author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, and he believes that Donald Lee Cheney was the Zodiac. And Donald Lee Cheney is, of course, the friend of prime suspect Arthur Leigh Allen. He was a former friend, actually. They had somewhat of a falling out, but the text is something that I would like to read for you guys here. I don't think Arthur Leigh Allen had anything to do with it. I think he was a patsy. If Allen's partner in crime threw him under the bus, why would he not attempt to return the favor? Hell, Allen could have left a note behind in the event of his death. That being said, why would Don Cheney bring attention to himself when he knows there were eyewitnesses? When I watched the video of him talking about the case, Don looked like he was being smug. His sentence structure implied he was either making things up on the spot or trying to remember talking points. Arthur Leigh Allen is, of course, the most famous Zodiac killer suspect. He's the subject of the 2007 film Zodiac. Robert Graysmith also wrote 2 books exploring Arthur Leigh Allen as the Zodiac killer, and he was indeed a suspect from law enforcement. Graysmith, of course, didn't create everything associated with Arthur Leigh Allen's theory, but there's this idea that Donald Lee Cheney comes forward in 1971 and points toward Allen as the Zodiac killer. Now, what I believe Stefano is going to say throughout the duration of this conversation is, why would somebody do that? If they were indeed the Zodiac, why would they bring anybody forward? Why would they even have some type of patsy if they were the Zodiac? And Drew Beeson has a response here. Cheney only wanted to keep Allen in check. He was probably worried Allen would spill the beans. Cheney's goal was to insert himself into the case and not see Allen go to jail. If Cheney had nothing to do with it, why implicate Allen? It's now a proven fact that Cheney lied multiple times. The eyewitness descriptions are all weak. They may have been okay at the time of the crimes, which is another reason why Cheney waited over a year and a half after the last murder of Paul Stine, that is, so he had time to grow his hair and mustache. Alright, so the first point is that, yes, it does appear that Donald Lee Cheney, the friend of Arthur Leigh Allen, does seem like he is a habitual liar. When you read Zodiac Unmasked, he's telling all these wild stories, but there's a chance that people could be telling the truth, right? No, Don Cheney is a proven liar. And the example that Drew Beeson frequently brings up is that in 2000, when Don Cheney was interviewed by Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com, he said that he had never heard of Blue Rock Springs Park, the site of the Zodiac Killer's second confirmed shooting, the murder of Darlene Ferrin that took place at Blue Rock Springs Park. But in 2007, when he was interviewed for the documentary, he said that he walked through Blue Rock Springs Park with Arthur Leigh Allen, and Leigh Allen gave him a tour, and normally people forget things with time. Somehow he either remembered that, or he just straight up lied. I mean, he's telling 2 different stories, and both of them can't be true. So, Stefano writes, thanks for responding. Do you mind if I explain why I think that the theory with Don Cheney is wrong? Let's assume Cheney has psychopathic tendencies. Also, let's pretend the past is the present. There are 3 things on his mind. Number 1, being the center of attention. Number 2, effing with authority. And number 3, self-preservation. Accusing Allen takes care of 1 and 2. Since he's a psychopath and lacks empathy, why wouldn't Cheney just kill Allen and make it look like a suicide? The authorities have proven they lack prowess and tech when it comes to crime scene evaluation. Instead, Don would literally risk bringing Allen face-to-face with interrogators. I know Allen was enjoying that type of attention for a while. That gets old when the media investigators start digging into your life. When Allen did that interview with the news in his front yard, you can tell that he has had enough with the accusations. And that's the one where he says, I'm not the damn Zodiac. And, yeah, it did seem like he was somewhat frustrated at that point. Maybe from the earlier ones, he's almost, milking the moment, getting in the spotlight, and he's having, a close-up. and he seems to be okay with that at that point. But I do agree that that probably got old, and they're truly invading Alan's life. I mean, as previously stated, he was the prime suspect. They're trying to catch a serial killer, and they thought it was him. So, well, why would Don Cheney not just kill Arthur Leigh Allen and make it look like a suicide? Something that Drew Beeson has talked about in the past is that he doesn't want Allen to be blamed for the Zodiac crimes. He wanted him to be the perfect patsy. But now, if Allen gets blamed for the Zodiac crimes, like, let's say that Don Cheney murders Arthur Leigh Allen, makes it look like a suicide, and he leaves a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt there, or one of the guns from one of the Zodiac crimes, everybody would think that Arthur Leigh Allen was the Zodiac killer. Then he would get credit for Don Cheney's criminal masterpiece in his mind. So, Drew Beeson wrote a response. Great observations. I love exchanges like this. Makes me think about it even deeper. Going with your statement, he lacked empathy and he wanted to mess with the cops and he wanted attention. That is the reason that Don came forward. The Zodiac killer appeared to want to mess with the cops and lack empathy and gain attention. Sounds like Don, question mark. To answer the question, why wasn't the Zodiac content to just get away with the crimes? Why did he expose himself? Why did the Zodiac expose himself to risk by sending in the letters and ciphers and taking the time to write on Brian Hartnell's car door? He could have been caught with the letters in his home or car if searched. He could have been seen writing on the car door. Very risky. The Stein attack was very risky and brazen. Shooting a cabbie in a densely populated area where he almost got caught, and probably would if the error in communication with the SFPD did not happen, looking for a black male and not a white male. You are correct that Allen never did implicate Cheney. Allen may have done so, but as he knows Cheney would then reveal the location of a gun or something with Allen's fingerprints on it, Don was a planner and most likely prepared for Allen coming back with him and saying, Don did it, not me. Cheney knew Allen's credibility was almost zero at the time. Cheney also knew that Allen could not prove it with physical evidence. I think Cheney made a calculated risk to come forward and insert himself into the case to keep Allen in check. If Allen accused Cheney of being involved, Cheney would accuse Allen, and it would give Allen a bit more credibility. Unfortunately, we will never know how much Allen knew about what Cheney was doing. Allen may have agreed to Cheney coming forward, and he was prepared for it. As you mentioned, he did like getting attention at first. Also, ponder the fact when Allen was told that Cheney was the source of the allegations against him, his response was something along the lines of, Don is a nice guy. That makes me think it was possible that Allen was at least initially agreeing to the accusal. Allen did not have the same nice response for Ralph Spinelli's accusations. It's a bizarre relationship between Cheney and Allen that we will never know the extent of. And overall, I do think that Drew is right about that one point. We will not know everything. Both Arthur Leigh Allen and Don Cheney have passed away. Allen died in 1992 and Donald Lee Cheney died in 2009, and no true deathbed confessions. It's possible that Arthur Leigh Allen did make a confession about 1 month prior to his death, up to being the Zodiac killer. It's possible that he confessed to that to the children known as the Seawaters, Dave and Connie Seawater. I would like to read the final segment that has been written out by Stefano. Please don't think I'm trying to be a contrarian for contrarian's sake. I appreciate the back and forth, and for some reason, if you're getting tired of the conversation, we can stop at any time. Traditionally, if a criminal team feels someone in the group will rat them out, that person gets whacked. Add psychopathic tendencies into the mix, and it wouldn't even be an afterthought. Serial killers have to feel that they are in control of the situation. Putting the police in touch with your partner by ratting him out is literally the opposite of control. If Don is the Zodiac, he likely disconnects himself from human compassion either consciously or subconsciously. I don't think there is a scenario where he would let Allen rat him out. As far as waiting so long, did he? He was messing with them almost the entire time, in one way or another, with the occasional break. You know the circumstantial evidence much better than I ever will. What circumstantial evidence is there other than hearsay and the watch, that's Arthur Leigh Allen's Zodiac watch, both of which I believe came from or were reported by Cheney? It's not that far-fetched for Cheney to have noticed the watch and created the name and symbol Zodiac. Maybe the fact that Zodiac didn't announce he had a name earlier because he may have glanced at the watch and thought it was catchy. Allen had the symbol on his wrist every single day. I imagine he would have learned about the nickname from the beginning. I guess there is the guns. Did they run any ballistics tests? Back in the 1960s and 70s, guns weren't as frowned upon as they are today, especially in the Bay Area. Well, to answer that question, to the best of my knowledge, yes, I do believe they ran some ballistics tests. You know all the details a lot more than I do. Just think about how much simpler it would be and how the amount of pieces get reduced if Allen was totally unaware of Don being the Zodiac. Once again, thanks for being open-minded. And one more time, that was written by Stefano, and he wanted me to respond to this conversation that he had with Drew Beeson. Point number one, I completely understand all of Drew's points. And, I also understand where Stefano's coming from, this whole thing about how if somebody is a psychopathic serial killer and this person knows his identity, he's not going to let him live, that he would just have him murdered in some way, or maybe Arthur Leigh Allen would just go out of town once and Don Cheney would murder him, and there would be no possible way to find out what happened to Leigh Allen, and we would just be saying, well, Arthur Leigh Allen disappeared and no one ever saw him again. Now, Drew can respond to this if he wants, but I think that the pathway he's going down is that Don Cheney seemed satisfied that they weren't looking at him as a true Zodiac killer suspect, even though he's just hiding in plain sight, he's getting away with it, and he's toying with them, so to speak, and he just doesn't think that there's any pressure on him. I mean, that's my honest takeaway from reading something like that, but you guys can also respond in the comments section down below. What do you think about Don Cheney as a Zodiac killer suspect? And what do you think about Arthur Leigh Allen as a Zodiac killer suspect? And is there any particular side of the story that you heard in that conversation that stands out to you? If Don Cheney had been the Zodiac and he's trying to frame Arthur Leigh Allen, why didn't he murder Allen and make it look like a suicide? You can respond in the comments section any way that you see fit. And I'd like to move on to the next topic. And this is also another requested one, and it comes to us from Midnight Ventures, who requested a response to the YouTube channel Bad Things True Crime. And Bad Things is actually, it seems like they have a conglomerate of YouTube channels, but the Bad Things True Crime one focuses a lot on serial killers. They actually have several serial killer episodes about the Zodiac Killer, and they did a recent episode on, and as previously stated, Bad Things True Crime has multiple episodes about suspect McDuff. However, they are a little bit repetitive. I think you would only need to watch one of them and you'd still get the full picture. The reason why they chose to do an updated episode was they said that Mike Morford, who brought McDuff forward as a Zodiac killer suspect, has some additional evidence which he has not revealed yet that he might be discussing with the authorities, with law enforcement, so we are going to wait patiently and see if there are any updates involving Zodiac suspect McDuff. But let's look at some of the reasons why they think that McDuff could be the Zodiac killer. He is someone who has a direct connection to something Zodiac-related, living near the payphone, and as Richard Grinnell of Zodiac Ciphers points out, that the Zodiac waited 40 minutes to make a phone call leaving Blue Rock Springs Park. Why would he take that long? I mean, he probably could have found a payphone much more quickly than that. Is it possible that he went home, changed his shirt, and made sure that he didn't have any blood on his clothing after the shooting? And then that's why he made the phone call and it's close to his house. And again, the whole concept of hiding in plain sight, so to speak. Also, the witness, surviving witness from the Blue Rock Springs shooting, Mike Michaud, described the shooter as 5 feet 8 inches tall, approximately 195 to 200 pounds, and McDuff was 5 feet 8 inches tall, 200 pounds. McDuff also has some similarities to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch that was done in 1969 after the Stein shooting, which also had a witness sighting of a 5'8" perpetrator. And somebody asked that in the comments section once, and I'm going to be speaking on Mike Morford's behalf, but I have interviewed him, as I said, on the Zodiac Killer channel's Interview with the Expert series. I was the host of that program as well, which I hope we will get back to at some point in the future. But they asked, why did Mike Morford ever look at Ross Sullivan as a Zodiac Killer suspect who was 6'2" and 300 pounds if he thinks that the Zodiac should be 5 feet 8 inches tall and 200 pounds? And Morph's response to that when I talked to him about it was just that he doesn't just immediately discard somebody based on their height or their weight, and he just is going to look at the person and evaluate them based on based on their findings, giving every suspect a chance, examining it through his own set of principles. But I think some of the most valuable evidence that Morph has put forward about McDuff's life is that he's looking at the stressors or the major life events that could have started the crime spree or ended the crime spree. Because in the Golden State Killer mystery, there were genuine stressors in this person's life and D'Angelo's life, or such as when around the birth of his first daughter, around the birth of his first kid, the crime stopped, and then around the time of the birth of his second kid, a crime happened again. So these are like major points in his life which are called stressors, but really it's just a significant life event. And if I understand the theory involving suspect McDuff, it is that he would have been somebody who would have been driven by heterosexual animosity. All the way to 1971, he didn't have a girlfriend, he didn't have an intimate partner, but he met his future wife in 1971, and he was married in 1974. Also in 1971, he started working for the state of California, and it's like he got his life on track. He found a woman, he found a career, and then that's when the Zodiac crime stopped, because this person no longer has hatred and animosity toward people who are doing, well, things with their life, and he wasn't. And in 1974, the Exorcist letter is mailed to put an end to the Zodiac Killer persona, talking about plunging into the billowy wave and the suicide's grave, which is a quote from the Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, but it's still putting an end to the Zodiac's persona. And then McDuff would just go on to work for the Department of Corrections in the state of California for 30 years, and he ultimately retired as a prison sergeant in the 1990s. McDuff has since passed away, but that is the stuff that I think is the most valuable point in Morph's theory. Let's look at the challenges involving suspect McDuff. He wore a size 8 shoe, and the Zodiac Killer's footprints collected from Lake Berryessa were size 10.5. He had a connection to Eureka, California. He owned a property there, and in 1990 the Zodiac Killer mailed the Eureka card. But his wife, his widow actually, says that that was just a lot that they almost did nothing with. It's not even a strong connection. But here's the bigger point. His widow states that the movie The Exorcist is discussed in the final Zodiac letter, or the final confirmed letter, The Exorcist letter, right? But McDuff did not see the movie The Exorcist until years later. She said that they saw it at a showing in Sacramento once, because it was just really hot outside and they didn't want to keep walking around in the heat, so they went to see The Exorcist, and they both didn't like it, and he hadn't seen The Exorcist yet the Zodiac says, "I saw and think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy ever," in that 1974 letter. But the thing about the size 8 shoe is a little bit that's the one that truly stands out to me. But what do you think about Zodiac Killer Suspect McDuff? And if you'd like to see some bigger presentations, you can go over to Bad Things True Crime, available here on YouTube. You can also visit some of the older Black Box Online Radio episodes. But please, share some feedback about Suspect McDuff. And yes, of course, people are keen to note that he does have a very noticeable set of ears. Not trying to be rude or anything to our buddy Mac, but that is not mentioned in any of the witness descriptions. The first time I saw the photo of McDuff, I was like, wow, very noticeable ears. You think somebody would have said something, particularly after the Stein shooting. But, I mean, maybe not. What do you think? You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. What do you think about Zodiac Killer Suspect McDuff? And moving on to the next segment here on Black Box Online Radio. Last week on the channel I was talking about the Zodiac Killer and Ted Bundy and doing a comparison between the two. Ted Bundy was a serial killer known as the Lady Killer. Perhaps he's the most famous serial killer in America, although that is somewhat up for debate. And there's actually an article on ZodiacKiller.com that discusses somewhat of a Zodiac Killer Ted Bundy connection. However, it's done in a different way. It was written by R.V. Shida and posted in the magazine The Bohemian, and I would like to read that for you now. Family members of the Zodiac victims have emailed Tom Boyd of ZodiacKiller.com to thank him for keeping the investigation going. Amateur sleuths from around the world send tips and engage in chat room discussions concerning their favorite suspects. Infamous names occasionally crop up. If verified, one tip receives a place, and then there is a discussion on serial killer Ted Bundy in Sonoma County between 1972 and 1973, when the bodies of 7 young women were discovered in rural areas just outside of Santa Rosa in a killing spree that is known as the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders or Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Slayings. At the time, Zodiac hysteria was at its height, and the Sonoma County Sheriff's Department considered the elusive serial killer the prime suspect. And I should point out that the Zodiac killer is still perhaps one of the prime suspects in the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker slayings. Most of the young women had been hitchhiking along or near Highway Route 101. The killer or killers preferred strangling the victims and discarding their nude bodies in rural roadside gullies, like so much that would be considered refuse. The victims ranged from age 12 to 22, and some were sexually assaulted. Today, the murder of those 7 young women is a matter of conjecture and not a fact. The case is unsolved. It's all speculation, says John Hess, a retired Sonoma County Sheriff's detective who helped lead investigations into the hitchhiker murders. Hess, now in his 70s, worked dozens of homicide cases during his career, but still recalls the names of each of the 7 victims. We could never come up with anything definitive. It's hard to say what happened. As uncomfortable as that may sound to the survivors, is the essence of a good mystery. The nagging doubt that Voight, as well as his companions Neil and Avie have, is an irresistible force drawing them back to a more innocent time when couples parked in lovers' lanes and young women hitched along Highway Route 101 on the corridor without fear, and no one had ever heard of the Zodiac Killer or Ted Bundy. Now, these crimes involving people going after single females, lone females, it's also been discussed in the disappearance of Donna Lass that Ted Bundy should be a bigger suspect than the Zodiac Killer, because that's mostly the way that Ted Bundy operated. He would go after women in vulnerable situations. I'm sure you've heard the story of how he was wearing a fake plaster cast on his arm, and he says, "My arm is broken, I need help with something." But on July 4th of 1969, 7 months after the slaying of a high school couple on Vallejo's Lake Herman Road, the Zodiac struck a second time, shooting and killing a 22-year-old woman and seriously injuring a 19-year-old man who were parked in the secluded Blue Rock Springs Park outside of Vallejo, not far from the scene of the first crime. After the attack, the killer brazenly called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone just blocks away from the station to inform them of the crime. Maybe it was suspect McDuff. Less than a month later, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner received letters. They said, "Dear Editor," and they began with hand-printed missive and replete with numerous misspellings and punctuation errors. The killer said, "This is the murder of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course. To prove them, I shall state some facts which only I and the police know." And indeed, such a list of facts was known only to the police and the killer, adding to the veracity of the letter. If there's any serial killer who rivals the Zodiac in the public's imagination, it's Ted Bundy. Between 1972 and 1978, he cut a bloody swath of murders and created mayhem throughout Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. His known victims, all young women, number more than 30. He is suspected in dozens of other unsolved murders. When the handsome, charming law student and successful escapee from jail in Colorado and Utah was finally apprehended in Florida in 1978, he was asked to estimate how many women he had killed. 1 figure, 2 figures, or 3 figures. Bundy held up 3 figures, according to authors Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth's 1983 book, The Only Living Witness. Michaud and Ainsworth interviewed Bundy on the Florida State Penitentiary's death row grounds, where he was awaiting execution for killing 2 college co-eds, a 12-year-old girl and a 12-year-old girl in that state. In addition to interviewing Bundy, the authors traced the killer's footsteps across the United States, where his trail was still relatively warm. This path led them to Northern California, where Bundy attended classes at Stanford University in Palo Alto in 1968 before dropping out. The only other evidence that the authors could find placing Bundy in that state was a 1973 flight from Seattle to San Francisco. Bundy had flown down to reconcile with a former girlfriend, a San Francisco socialite, who had dumped him after he washed out at Stanford. Bundy was able to charm her once again, and the couple became engaged. Then Bundy flew back to Seattle and dumped her. Not long after that, women began disappearing in the Seattle area. And that woman is, of course, Stephanie Brooks. And a lot of people believe that she was a big influence on Ted Bundy's victim profiling, although Stephanie Brooks is not her real name. That was a pseudonym that was given to her by the media. In other books written about the case, most notably Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, Bundy's failed Northern California relationship is seen for a possible catalyst for the murderous rampage. I mean, I think there are a lot of other catalysts for Ted Bundy's rampage, particularly the relationship that he had with his mother, as well as the relationship with his father. I mean, this article is even going to point out that, yes, that is, of course, talking about victim profiling and how Ted Bundy would choose his victims, but I think that's how Stephanie Brooks had the biggest influence on him. And yes, that's just another disastrous life event, and what they might be trying to say is, okay, he had these terrible traumatic experiences, and that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, or that was something that opened the floodgates for his murderous rage, but I still don't think so. I think it's everything else, partnered with the obsessions with pornography, and some things that I will talk about perhaps in some future episodes. Morbidity. When I was watching one of the Ted Bundy documentaries, they were talking about how exposure to intense amounts of morbidity can have a very negative effect on some people, and it actually drives them to, become serial killers. But just pointing out that Ted Bundy's crimes are way more similar to the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings than that of the Zodiac killer, and I mean, if you notice any similarities or differences between Ted Bundy and the Zodiac, you can write them in the comments section, as well as Ted Bundy and the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayer. Now, moving on to the next segment, last week on the channel, I was talking to you guys about a book that is out there. It's actually a booklet. It's called Zodiac Killer Identity, Joseph Paul Franklin. It's written by Sam Fisher, and he actually has 2 publications out about the Zodiac on Amazon.com. I pulled up a free sample of it, but then I thought, you know what? As my friend Macklemore would say, it was 99 cents, so I decided to get the book anyway. Again, 30 pages, and I can't say that it was the most fascinating read, but there are 2 major points that I want to share with you guys, and I did a larger discussion on Joseph Paul Franklin last week on the Zodiac Killer News Report, if you'd like to hear more about some specific points. But after reading the book, I thought it was very odd that Sam Fisher left out that his Zodiac suspect was known as the racist killer. Yes, Joseph Paul Franklin was a real serial killer, and he was a traveling serial killer. He operated in different states around the country, and I see how that explains the Zodiac's infrequency and activities, or how the Zodiac would commit a crime spree in California in 1968 and 69, as well as all these possible other crimes. He's a traveling serial killer, and there are real traveling serial killers out there. There's even Ted Bundy, whom we were just discussing. He operated in multiple states. Not exactly a traveling killer, but he operated in various geographic places around the United States of America. Then there are real traveling serial killers like Tommy Lynn Sells, the coast-to-coast killer, also known as the cross-country killer, and possibly Edward Wayne Edwards, although a lot of the crimes that have been attributed to him have been misrepresented by John Cameron. However, when it comes to Joseph Paul Franklin, he was called the racist killer, and not once did I see that name used in this book by Sam Fisher. Oh yeah, well, he was a racist assassin who mostly targeted African Americans. I mean, all that stuff was completely left out, and I thought that was very odd. But then, there is another additional point, and that is that Sam Fisher proposes that the Zodiac Killer should be the prime suspect in the murder of Tammy Jo Alexander, and this was a crime that I was not familiar with. So to help us out, I would like to go over to an article from ATI, allthat'sinteresting.com, written by Katie Serena, just citing the source, and it says, "Who was Tammy Jo Alexander?" Tammy Jo Alexander had an unhappy childhood and split among foster homes in her grandmother's place, and she had a deeply troubled issue with her mother in Brooksville, Florida. According to the New York Daily News, Alexander was an experienced hitchhiker by the time she was 15 years old. While waitressing at a truck stop cafe, she often caught rides with long-haul truckers. As we see, this is going to be another story of a woman who was hitchhiking, abducted, and murdered. People were just drawn to her, said her high school friend Laurel Noel, who remembered her bubbly personality and smile. In 1978, Noel and Alexander briefly ran away together. The 15-year-olds managed to hitchhike all the way to Los Angeles, but ultimately Noel's parents ended up flying both teens back. Noel learned from Alexander's sister Pamela Dyson that Alexander had taken off yet again in 1979. Only this time she did not return. Dyson believed that Alexander ran away to escape a bad home life. My mother put Joan Crawford to shame. That is a reference to the movie Mommy Dearest. Dyson said later, describing her mom as a screamer and a slapper. According to Alexander's high school boyfriend, she left Brooksville for good in the spring of 1979. This was just a few months before she would be found dead at the age of 16 and left to rot in a cornfield more than 1,000 miles away. The discovery of the girl in the cornfield. In 1979, the body of a young woman was discovered in Caledonia, New York, which is about 23 miles southwest of Rochester. She was found wearing a plaid shirt, tan corduroy jeans, and a red windbreaker with a color label that read Auto Sports Products Inc. She had been murdered, shot with a .38 caliber weapon. After being shot once in the head, she was apparently dragged into the cornfield from the road and then shot in the back. But since she had no form of identification, detectives struggled to find out who she was. For years she was known as Caledonia Jane Doe and then shortened to Cali Doe as the search continued. Her corpse did offer a few clues to the police. From her bikini tan lines, authorities could tell that she had traveled to brisk autumnal New York from a warm climate elsewhere. They examined pollen on her body to determine that she had likely grown up in Southern California or Florida. However, since the keychains on her belt loops were sold at New York thruway rest stops, it was clear that she had been recently traveling. When police searched the area, they learned that the mysterious girl had apparently stopped for dinner at about 8:30 p.m. the previous night in nearby Lima. She enjoyed a simple meal of ham, potatoes, and corn. Her dining companion was an unidentified man. The potential person of interest was 5 feet or 5'8" 9 inches tall, with curly hair and glasses. And this is one of the big reasons why Sam Fisher is trying to make the Zodiac Killer connection. He thinks that the composite sketch is very similar to that of the Zodiac Killer and of his Zodiac Killer suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin. But if I can be very honest with you, I think it looks a lot more like Richard Gaikowski than it does Joseph Paul Franklin. Marge Bradford was the waitress that night and said, "Why would somebody buy dinner and then kill them 45 minutes later and throw them in a cornfield?" And this is where I have to stop and throw in a particular interjection. That type of behavior happens in true crime cases all the time, very sadly. This story is almost identical to the story of Valentine Sally, which I've shared on this channel before. Valentine Sally was a name that was given to an unidentified missing person. Her body, not only her body, her remains have also been identified. She has been identified, is a better way to put it. She has been identified as Carolyn Eaton. She was murdered in 1982, and it's a very similar story. She stops at a truck stop with an older gentleman, and again, there's a Zodiac connection because some people think the older man is Arthur Leigh Allen. They're eating together, and then, most likely, she is murdered. Valentine Sally was not shot. She was most likely smothered with a pillow in the back of a sleeper cab in a big rig truck. But Tammy Jo Alexander was shot. Why would somebody do this? Very simply, a sexual advance gone wrong. So the man makes an unwanted sexual advance on the woman, and she either refuses him or maybe says something that that bothered him, and he's humiliated, or he's afraid that she'll go to the police, so he murdered her. Or there could even be something to the point where he is just bothered by some type of comment that she made, and he thought that she would get away with it. And, he thought that he would get away with it, too. He thought that he would get away with a crime, and he wants to prevent her from, no, you're not going to talk to me that way, so he murders her because he can dump her body and disappear. These types of crimes happen all the time in the true crime world, and it's absolutely sickening. Look at the Highway of Tears, for example, in Canada. Many people are hitchhiking across Canada because of the lack of transportation centers, and they are murdered and buried along a highway in Western Canada. Very similar stories. And this also heavily reminds me of the story of Marcia King, the Buckskin Girl. She was also known as Buckskin Doe, and they used some very similar methods in forensic investigations, particularly the palynology testing, like examining the pollen to try and see where that she lived, where Cali Doe, now known as Tammy Jo Alexander, was successfully identified as well. And as far as this Zodiac connection, you guys know that I don't think too strongly of any of these victims, like Valentine Sally, I should just call her Carolyn Eaton, as well as Tammy Jo Alexander. I think that this is representative of a much bigger problem, and that is the dangers of hitchhiking, which these crimes happened decades ago. But the also just this entire concept of how people don't quite understand that individuals will commit crimes if they believe that they will not be caught, they will not be apprehended, and they will not be punished for it. Clear as day. Why would somebody buy somebody dinner and 45 minutes later murder them? Because they weren't afraid of getting caught. They weren't getting the sex that they wanted. They hated their mother, and they wanted to do something destructive. And I think that that's my ultimately, my intake on that. I mean, again, as I said, I've given my feedback on the book about Joseph Paul Alexander as a Zodiac Killer suspect, The Zodiac Killer Identity, Joseph Paul Franklin, available on Amazon.com, and I've also done some responses to Tammy Jo Alexander's case, but that'll be a very easy segue into the next subject. I'd like to give a shout out to Z247, that's the name of the YouTube user, and he says, I once watched a movie called The Dead Girl, and it goes through a lot of the things you discussed on your show today. We're talking about the previous episode that I had done on Ted Bundy, and as I said, I'm responding to more requests as well as your recommendations, and there's a copy of the movie The Dead Girl available here on YouTube for free. It was made in 2006, and it features Brittany Murphy, Toni Collette, as well as a host of other famous celebrities, also James Franco and Josh Brolin. Josh Brolin plays a regular client, like not exact. For a while you think that he's a boyfriend, but it turns out he is just a client to a prostitute. I didn't even recognize him, so credit to him in that. And in this movie, The Dead Girl, firstly, I love Brittany Murphy, the late Brittany Murphy. I mean, she maybe it wasn't the most challenging role, but she absolutely did a fantastic job. She's playing, by her own admission, a hooker and just someone who has had a very rough life, and she just captured the mannerisms and like the vocal tonality, just all of that was spot on. But it does discuss a lot about serial killer psychology. If you ever watch this, the first 10 to 15 minutes get very deep in this stuff, and they're talking about a fictional serial killer. And two people are having a conversation, and they're saying that this fictional serial killer used to go into, girls' dresser drawers and women's dresser drawers when he was a kid, like maybe 12 or 13, and he would take out their clothing or even their undergarments and start cutting them up. And then one character, played by Toni Collette, asks, why would he do that? And the answer was, it made him feel happy. And she says, no, well, why did he become a serial killer? And the response was that he hated his mother. It's usually almost always hating his mother. And there is a lot of that associated with serial killers who go on to target female victims. Some serial killers, such as John Wayne Gacy, target male victims mostly, and John Wayne Gacy was beaten severely by his father. Even John Wayne Gacy's own sister said that their father would beat them with a leather strap, and he would be relentless. He would not listen to them when they just begged for mercy. He showed absolutely no regard for that, and John Wayne Gacy went on to be a serial killer that targeted males. There's also another very good observation that was made by longtime BBOR listener Joy Bradford, that John Wayne Gacy was a bisexual, and perhaps he was ashamed of his homosexuality, and that's why he wanted to commit these serial murders in secret. But with a lot of serial killers, possibly even the Zodiac Killer, there is animosity towards somebody's mother. And, I mean, the film The Dead Girl doesn't completely do lessons and lectures on serial killer psychology. They're just in different places. But what they did also want to point out is the character played by Brittany Murphy was the victim of abuse from her stepfather, not her biological father, but her stepfather. And again, she goes on to be a hooker by her own admission. But her mother was played by Marcia Gay Harden, and it was one of the few times that I actually liked Marcia Gay Harden in a performance. I normally don't like her as an actress too much, but they talked about the dynamic between mother and daughter as well with Brittany Murphy's character, and that can show that there are types of abuse that people experience that are not purely physical. It's not only about beatings. There's also neglect. There's also underappreciation. She just talks about how her mother's not paying attention to how she feels, and she's always doing things for her own convenience and not recognizing how her actions affect her daughter. And that's heavily tied into some of the other things explored in the movie about how just it relates to serial killers and just the lack of bonding with their parents. And no, Brittany Murphy's character was not the serial killer, but that they tied it in to everybody. They're trying to show how the influences from someone's parents are the biggest on their lives, and they drive people to behave in certain ways, and it gets very Freudian talking about the actions and behaviors of your parents model your sexuality, personality, and the entirety of the persona. As far as connections to real-life serial killers, I definitely believe that is true in regards to the traumatic aspects, that the emotional trauma that somebody experiences in relation to their parents is one of the biggest factors, and maybe it might even be the biggest factor that would drive somebody to become a serial killer. But there's a particular piece of pushback that I would give to that person in the movie, even though he's not a real person. He said that this fictional serial killer is cutting up women's clothing, and it made him feel happy. I'm not completely convinced that people do that. I'm not completely convinced that somebody would feel happiness doing that, because everything that I've learned about serial killers, and I've talked to you guys about serial killers here on BBOR, shows that there's a difference between happiness and fueling one's own excitement. Because it sounds like what serial killers do, in my own non-first-hand approach and opinion, is it's about fueling the excitement. The way that somebody who is venting and complaining is not happy when they're doing it, they're venting and complaining, and they can be shouting and screaming, and they aren't showing signs of happiness. No. They're doing what we would call letting off steam. They're doing very intense emotional things because they're trying to calm their system down. And with serial killers, it often is not described as anything to do with happiness. It's about unleashing rage, letting their frustrations out, letting their emotions out, and definitely not happiness. But if anyone wants to challenge me on that, you can write your idea in the comment section down below. And one more time, the movie is The Dead Girl, available here on YouTube for free. Maybe it's on some other streaming services, but I watched it here on YouTube. And right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. One more time, you can support this show with BuyMeACoffee.com. Anybody who makes a donation to BBOR will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. If you make a shout-out on... Oh my god, why is this so hard to say? If you make a donation or contribution to help support the show using BuyMeACoffee.com, you will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. Whew. Oh, goodness, got it out that time. I didn't think I was going to make it. And our first one comes to us from Stefan Nyberg, who says, "Hey Ned, it's been said that coffee is the elixir of life. I'm leaving that open for discussion. Please enjoy a couple cups of coffee with this donation and have a great Easter weekend." Hey Stefan, thank you so much for your continued and reliable support. Stefan was also the person who wrote the excellent essay on the Exorcist letter. And our next one comes to us from Kaufman K, who says, "Kaufman K bought you a coffee." That's a nice ring to it. And there is not a message on that one, but of course you get your shout out all the same. So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you would like to help out the channel. And also, be on the lookout for something new. I wrote the book Killer on a White Horse, which is a novel that was inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, and I am working on the sequel to that one, the second book in that series, and I understand that some other people are working on a couple novels as well. You guys in the comments section, so I'm going to be following your progress as well. You can post your updates here in the comments section. If you also want to just get a shout out, help you and promote your books, then I will gladly do that for you. Just keep me posted on that. But look out for the next installment in the White Horse Saga, which will be coming out perhaps near the end of the year. I mean, that's just a possibility. Don't quote me on that one, but that's just what I have in mind. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.